where the hills come down steeply to the water, and although there was no snow on them in July, they were still magnificent. And looking 360 degrees, there was a tremendous panorama of the lake and the hills and the surrounding country. Graduation was a heady time. Not only did it mean the end of boot camp, which we really didn't enjoy very much, but it meant that we could go home for a week's leave of absence, or week's leave as we called it. I came back home with a buddy of mine from the same company who lived just a few miles away from Troutdale, and since I was given the use of the 37 Chevrolet sedan which the family now owned, I thought I was really living. My buddy's first name was Dick. I don't remember his last name, but he had a fiancée, and also they found a girlfriend for me, and we went on a date or two, but I wasn't interested in the friend, so I decided to strike out on my own and see what I could do. I remembered my friend Donald Boyle, who used to live near me when I was on Jessup Street, living with my grandfather. This goes back some years, but I knew where he lived and looked him up. Well, he was waiting to be called to go into the Navy. He was just old enough and had volunteered. His father was already in the Navy and was a cook, and Don wanted to follow in his footsteps. The person I was interested in was Patricia, or Pat, who was a year older than I, but we had become kind of friends from years past, and I asked her if she wanted to go out. She said, of course. So we spent the rest of the week together whenever we could get away, whenever she wasn't working. She had a job, and I couldn't get the car all the time, of course. When my leave was up and I had to go back to boot camp, back to be transferred, I was sure that she was the girl for me for the rest of my life. So we bid our fond goodbyes at the train station, and I headed back to Farragut, Idaho. When I got to Farragut, since I was a candidate for radar school, I and a couple of other fellows who were also in the same situation, also candidates, were given the job as yeoman. Yeoman meaning the secretary, Navy secretary. And our job was to call the roll, or take muster as they call it, 3 times a day to make sure everyone was there in the outgoing unit, the OGU as they called it. Each of us were waiting for our orders to tell us where we would be going from boot camp. Of course, we who were going to radar school knew that we would be going to school someplace. As yeomen, we had quite a lot of power because we had the authority to write permission slips for fellows to go to the head of the line, the head of the chow line, 3 times a day. And this applied to the yeomen as well. So I would write a slip for my buddy, and he would write one for me, and that way we would be able to go to early chow. Obviously, we couldn't sign our own names, but we could sign each other's. After about a week in OGU, I got my orders, and I was to be stationed at Wright Junior College in Chicago. Well, this was the middle of winter. It was December. I didn't know winters could get so cold. A junior college building occupied 1 full block in an otherwise residential neighborhood, and the Navy had taken over the whole building. Now, the purpose of this school was what was called preschool, and it was here that we learned some fundamentals of machine shop and fundamentals of electricity. But really, it was more like another outgoing unit where we were putting in our time, because a lot of our days were spent in just maintenance work around the building, clean up, mopping the floors, but above all, eating. Food was just wonderful there. It was so much better than it had ever been at boot camp. The cooks just seemed to do the very best they could to make the food as delicious as possible. It was hard not to gain weight. And of course, we really didn't care because it was cold outside. Part of the time we spent in doing guard duty, which meant walking around the perimeter of the building, in other words, the sidewalk, with a billy club and a silly board that had orders on it telling us what to do in case we were approached by any senior officers. And I was on guard duty one day, walking along around the perimeter, when a car stopped, and there were 2 young ladies in the back seat of the car, and they opened the door and they said, "Get in." I said, "No, I can't. I'm on guard duty." "Oh, just toss that board and the billy club in the bushes and come with us. We'll have some fun." But being a true blue Navy man, I refused their request. I could just imagine the problems I could get into if I went with them. Just to leave my duty post could have gotten me into real trouble. Another thing I will always remember about Wright Junior College in Chicago was the trip I made out to Great Lakes Naval Air Station, or Great Lakes Naval Training Station, I should say, to get a pair of shoes. And we went everywhere on the streetcar and L, it was as it was called. Part of the time the streetcar was above ground, and part of the time it was underground in the subway. And I got instructions as to how to get to the naval station. I got on the streetcar and started out. And I knew it was 5 degrees below zero outside, but I thought, well, it'd be no problem because the streetcars will be heated. They weren't. And the farther I rode, the colder I got. By the time I got to the Naval Training Station, I could hardly navigate. I was so cold. Well, I got my shoes and got back to Wright Junior College, and finally got thawed out. But what a trip that was. I spent Christmas there at Wright Junior College. It wasn't much of a Christmas. I did get a package from my mother, from my folks. And aside from that, why, there wouldn't have been any Christmas. I think there were some cookies in it and some candy and, of course, a letter. But the thing that I missed that Christmas really was the fact that the letters from Pat Boyle had become fewer and farther between. And by the time Christmas got there, she was telling me in her last letter that she wouldn't be writing anymore, that she had found someone else that she was going steady with. It was the day after Christmas that a group of us got our orders that we were headed south. We were going to the University of Houston for primary school. Well, we had some idea what primary school was like, but we had no idea what Houston was like in the middle of December, or almost the 1st of January. We were loaded into not Pullmans or day coaches, but cattle cars. At least that's what the Navy guys called them. They were just box cars that had been modified so that we had bunks in one car, and we had a place to get our chow in another car. We went in for chow. We took trays, and there was a line of kettles down the middle of the car with cooks standing behind each one. And to keep from slopping the soup and any other thin liquids, they had boards floating in the top, on the top of the liquid, so that it wouldn't slosh too much. And they'd run the dipper or ladle down between the boards. This was not a very comfortable way to ride, but at least it got us there. The farther south we went, the warmer it got. And by the time we got to Houston, it was just raining. And it was so wonderful. It must have been 40 or 45 degrees. It was like going into summertime from what we'd been used to. Well, the Navy had taken over a portion of the campus there at University of Houston. They had taken over the gymnasium and the library, or library during certain hours, and had put up a building for barracks, for latrine, which was toilets. And because it was so much warmer, it was a real relief to get billeted in a gymnasium where it wasn't so cold. The day after we arrived was New Year's Day. We got there New Year's Eve. And of course, the thing that we fellas wanted to do was go see the town. The three of us got together to share a taxi. There were taxis waiting out front, hoping for fares from the Navy. And one of the fellows that I was buddying with right then was a fellow by the name of Don Kiesling. And Don Kiesling had gone to NYA radio school with me in Portland. And I saw him briefly when we were in Wright Junior College. And the reason that it was briefly was that I was held over for a week at Wright Junior College because of illness. So that's how it happened that even though he was in a later class than mine, we left at the same time and got down to Houston together. And were enrolled in the primary school at the same time. So we got a taxi out front and headed downtown. We had no idea what we'd find. We got down there, we walked around a little bit, and not knowing what else to do, decided that we'd go see a movie. We decided on the movie we wanted to see and got into line to get tickets. And in the line ahead of us were three pretty girls, all wearing fur coats. I thought this was unusual, to find three girls all wearing coats that were pretty much alike and all pretty. And we were looking for dates. At least we didn't know what else we were looking for. As long as they were standing there and we were standing there, why not dates? We got into the movie and we took seats behind the three girls. And I don't know how much any of us saw of the movie because we kept talking to them and bothering them, and at least they said we were bothering them. And although it was, maybe it had been threatening rain when we went into the movie, when we got out it was just pouring. The rain was coming down in torrents. Well, the girls called home and one of them got their parent to come get them. And it was just a little coupe when she pulled up. And we were standing there in the rain. We'd been trying to get a taxi. No taxis were available. And when that girl's mother saw us standing in the rain there, helping the girls into the car, she said, "Let these boys get in too. We'll take them home and dry them out." So I don't know how we managed, but 7 of us got into that Model A sedan and got out to the girls' house. And that girl's name was Mary Elizabeth Allen. Mary's mother, Dorothy, made us take our wet jumpers off and hang them on the lines in the bedroom or living room, I don't recall. And then we sat around the gas heater to get dried out the rest of the way. And she fixed some hot drink for us. And as late as it was, she insisted that we spend the night. So, I don't know where Mary slept, I guess with her younger sister. And us 3 fellows slept in her bed. It was quite a night. I don't know how much sleep we actually got. And in the morning, she made breakfast for us. And we got dressed, got our jumpers back on, and went out to the university on the bus. Or maybe she took us in the car, I don't recall now. She borrowed the car from her brother, and he may have needed it back. Our curriculum at Houston University consisted of what the Navy called primary school. And this was basic radio, in which we learned the wiring diagram for 5-tube AC/DC superheterodyne receiver, much like we had studied in NYA radio school. But we had to draw the whole schematic from memory, which was good practice for us. We also had courses in electronic engineering, such as electricity and AC vectors and slide rule practice, things such as that. As interesting as this was, my mind was more on a cute little redhead that I had met on New Year's Day. I kept in touch with her, taking the bus out to her house every chance I got, every bit of free time. And it wasn't long before I realized that this was the girl that I needed to spend the rest of my life with. I wanted to be with her all the time. Also, I wanted to show Oregon to her. I knew the Navy would be moving us, but that didn't matter. I still wanted to get married, and Mary was willing. So, on April 9th, 1944, we tied the knot. We did this in the First Unitarian Church in Houston. Since we were trying to cut expenses on this wedding, and since I was a florist's son, I went to the local florist and made a deal with them where I made the corsage and boutonnieres, the corsages rather, and boutonnieres, and it cut down our expenses considerably on the flowers, on the florist part of it. We had an overnight honeymoon at Mary's house after the wedding, and because I had to get back to the base the next morning. Incidentally, after my class was over, I managed to stay on another couple of weeks there in Houston at the university as a supernumerary, as they were called, which was student instructor. So that made it nice. We didn't have to make any sudden changes for a couple of weeks after more like 3 weeks after the wedding. Then I got my orders where I was being transferred to Corpus Christi, Texas, which was about 200 miles south and west, Corpus Christi being on the Gulf, right on the Gulf of Mexico. Corpus Christi was the Navy's school for airborne radio and radar, and this was very intriguing for me. If it hadn't been for my putting in for airborne equipment, I'd have been sent to Treasure Island for shipboard equipment, shipboard gear. That didn't appeal to me in the least. The school was on what was called Ward Island. It was a separate, totally separate peninsula devoted to that school and that only. There was a main base, which was several miles on down the road, where there was Navy Flight School. It was to Ward Island that I reported, and found to my surprise when I got there that the classes were full. We were put on a waiting list, which meant that we got KP duty, and I soon found myself in the deep sinks. It was the job of 3 or 4 of us to clean all the pots and pans that were used in the chow hall. This was real work, but the advantage was that we'd work for about 3 days steady and then we were given a couple of days off. So when I got my 2 days off, I'd get out and hitchhike to Houston to see my wife. Oh, those were the days. Sometimes I wish I could go back and relive them. That was a long 200 miles to hitchhike. But it usually worked out all right. There was always somebody headed up the road or down the road to take me to Houston and bring me back. As I recall, the class at Ford Island, which was called secondary school, was about 6 weeks in duration. Could have been 8. It was during this time that my wife and my mother-in-law came to Corpus Christi to visit me. And the idea was that maybe if they could find housing for my wife, that she could move down there and I would get a pass to go ashore every night, except when I was on patrol duty, patrolling the grounds, that is. Well, we looked and found one shacky place, moved in, Mary with some of her clothes and bedding, and her mother went back home, of course. So then it was necessary that I get back and forth from the base to where we lived. And this meant riding on the bus. Later we found a little better place to live, but it wasn't much better. The advantage was that at least we had our own separate place that had cooking facilities. We had a community shower that we shared with several other cottages. We could see daylight through the cracks in the siding, but at least we had our own place. At the end of the course in secondary school, they asked if anybody would like to stay on as instructor. Of course, that appealed to me. I thought that would be wonderful, and it was, really was. So I volunteered and was made a lab instructor for a type of radar equipment. Radar equipment that I taught was a type that was slung on the bomb rack of a fighter plane. And it was a search intercept type of radar, which meant these planes used this radar to go into battle. As a lab instructor, it was my job to take care of a lab set up with a piece of this equipment that was in working order and that looked out a window of the building. I thought this was just wonderful. I was glad that I didn't get a job as a classroom instructor, which meant that I'd have had to learn all of the ins and outs of all of the circuitry and then stand up in front of the class and give a discourse on how each circuit worked and give tests at the end of each session, and it just didn't appeal to me. I much preferred to be working in the lab and having the responsibility of making sure that this piece of equipment was in good working order. And part of the fun of it was that toward the end of each class session, toward the end of each class, I should say, we would give tests. Not only give tests, but we would put different troubles on the equipment, simulating the failure of a given part, and see how long it took the students to find the trouble. Meanwhile, things ashore took a turn for the better in that we found a place where we could rent a room in a home, and the lady who owned the place was very nice, relatively young, and she was just an excellent person to deal with. Pleasant, friendly, and we enjoyed her immensely. Can't remember her name, unfortunately. No, I do remember her name. Her first name, anyway, was Wanza, spelled with a W. W-A-N-Z-A. Well, I happen to remember it, but there it is. One thing I thought was interesting was that being in Corpus Christi, Texas, this was subtropical climate, and in Wanza's backyard was a banana tree that had a few ripe bananas on it. Well, this idyllic situation went on all summer and into the fall. When one day I was called into the office of the officer in charge, the ONC as we called him, and I was told I was being transferred. He said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're being transferred to a place called Tongue Point, Oregon." He says, "You probably have no idea where that is." He says, "By the way, where's your hometown?" And I said, "Portland, Oregon," which, of course, is 80 miles away. He gave a sheepish grin and he said, "Well, you're one of the lucky ones, aren't you?" Well, this move meant that we had so many days to make the trip, and we got our tickets, gathered up our belongings, and loaded onto the train and headed northwest to Portland, Oregon. And when I got there, I got in touch with my folks, who were then living a little closer in Portland, on a street called Hartley Avenue, in which we've since been unable to locate since they changed the name and gave it a number now. but was in the Rockwood School District. We know that much. Roland and Curtis were enrolled in the school there. I have a little aside here in that while I was in the service, up pretty close to the time that we were sent to Oregon on orders, my mother had been working in the shipyard, and her job in the shipyard was as a welder. Not Rosie the Riveter, but Doris the welder. And I guess she learned to weld pretty well because she passed all of her tests with flying colors. And she and Glenn drove back and forth to the shipyard every day. They left the boys with the Grinnells, with Etta Grinnell in Troutdale, and then I guess when they moved into Portland, they took the boys with them and left them at the daycare facility there on the base, at Oregon shipyards. This was a common thing in those days for the shipyards to provide that service for employees with children. Now, getting back to our situation, it was necessary for Mary to find a place to stay because as soon as I reported for duty at Tongue Point, which is just right near Astoria, Oregon, I was to report for duty in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and that duty was to take a look at the line maintenance school that was established there, so that we could come back to Tongue Point then and set up the same kind of a school at Tongue Point, except for the fact that this would be for PB-4Ys rather than the other type of aircraft that we saw in Minnesota. It was while we were in the facility in Minneapolis that I met and made good friends with two people. One was Kermit Harrell and his wife Helen, and the other was George Thatcher and his wife Elda. We became good buddies while we were there in cold Minneapolis. We were there in the middle of wintertime, and we found out what it was like to live there. It was probably 20 degrees outside and crisp. We didn't have any snow coming down while we were there. The snow was already on the ground, and we were crunching through it to go from one building to the next. While we were there looking over that facility, Mary was staying with Clinton's wife, Donna, Clinton's first wife. And Clinton was in the Air Force at that time. It just happened that Donna's mother had a cottage over in Long Beach, Washington, which is right across the Columbia River. You took the Megler Ferry and to get over there. And she stayed with Donna all the time that I was back in Minneapolis. This worked out very well because when Mary met my folks and beheld the